Welcome to Exploring the Bioage. In this edition, we'll be discussing the Pampas in South America and why such large swaths of southern and central South America are largely treeless. It's a major ecological conundrum because the soils are extremely fertile. The climate is such that it's more than wet enough to expect trees to grow vigorously. And so we have this delightful puzzle. Why are you able to drive for hundreds of kilometers through a grassland without seeing trees over extremely fertile soils and a relatively wet climate? Why are you not driving through a forest? It's a delicious puzzle, and I look forward to diving into the details with you.
Yes, and once we've set that scene in terms of posing the basic ecological puzzle, we can go on to explore what actually happens in this fascinating grassland in Buenos Aires province in Argentina called the Pampas. In terms of the original fauna, both at the end of the Pleistocene, when it was something to make the Serengeti look modest, and then in the Holocene, when it was essentially devoid of big game, but had hunter-gatherers living on it, until the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, and then carrying on into the period of the gauchos and the modern period, in which most of the Pampas has been converted to agriculture or dairy farming. But the ecology of the Pampas is fascinating from many different perspectives, but essential to understanding the Pampas is this basic setting, which is that the one thing about the Pampas that all listeners need to appreciate before we go on is that it is the foremost example worldwide of an anomalous ecosystem, in the sense that everything indicates it should be a dense, tall forest, and yet it's a relentlessly grassy area, to the degree that there is no woody flora in the Pampas. You know, even the short grass prairies of North America had a woody flora. The Pampas doesn't have a woody flora, and in fact, even Pampas grass, this is a widespread misconception. When people think of the Pampas and they think back to biology textbooks from high school, they think of the Pampas as being this tall, feathery grass called Pampas grass. Nothing like that is true. Cortaderia, Pampas grass, has virtually nothing to do with the Pampas. The Pampas is basically just a short grass prairie, a dense short grass prairie, about half of which is so treeless, so lacking in evapotranspirative power, that the copious rainfall just sits around and actually floods the grassland, making it into a flooded Pampas, in which the dairy cows have to walk for several months of the year with their hooves wet in order to get to the grass. And semi-aquatic rodents such as coipu and capybara are the largest grazers in this sloshing ecosystem, where the water that should be going up into tree canopies is just lying around unused, getting in the way of grass growth. So deeply puzzling. At first sight, it seems extremely ordinary to the Spaniards who came in the early 1500s and encountered the Pampas. It must have seemed very ordinary in the sense that it just looked like an enormous natural pasture. But it's only with a global context and an ecological framework that one realizes that what springs out from this apparently mundane scene is one of the greatest ecological puzzles of all time, and on which there's almost no literature. The ecological literature on the real nature of the Pampas is negligible. And so what we're going to be,
Sorry to interrupt. I would imagine that a number of, or many ecologists would ask you, why are the following explanations not sufficient to explain the lack of trees? That it burns frequently, or that the waterlogging keeps the trees out. And then they might also throw in the point that there actually are some trees From the Pampas, Phytolacca, for example, is a famous Pampas tree, but I assume it only occurs in very specific localities. So look forward to your thoughts on those.
Yes, well, phytolacca does occur, and it does occur only in specific localities. And it's not a good example of a tree because it's a weird sort of semi-succulent thing. It would be nice to know what the original ecological incidence of phytolacca was. It's difficult to know now because that ecosystem, that arable part of the Pampas, has been so thoroughly converted to agriculture now. It's one of the most productive farmlands on earth. It's why Argentina, about a century ago, was one of the richest nations on earth at the time. It subsequently fell out of fortune because it became so corrupt that it's now a kind of an international joke. But at that time, it was far wealthier than, for example, Australia. And that's
as a result of the beef.
The beef, yes, beef and arable crops to some degree. I mean, basically in the Pampas, anything you plant just grows well, including livestock. And in fact, as we will be seeing in a subsequent episode in the series on the Pampas, one of the most remarkable things that happened in the Pampas is that shortly after 1500, when the Spaniards gave up in disgust because they arrived at the Pampas looking for silver, not for anything else. And they found no silver. And so they basically left and they cut loose some of their cattle and horses. And the livestock basically took the Pampas over. It was such a wonderful pasture that within a century or two, the place had become a kind of a feral paradise. But just to frame the context a little bit more, let's just go back for a second and ask ourselves, what is the range of vegetation heights in the terrestrial vegetation of the world, focusing on fairly moderate environments, climates that are not too extreme. So if you exclude, for example, deserts, the mountaintops, and the tundra, what is the range of vegetations that one gets in the world? And it's remarkably wide. Again, this is a puzzle that hasn't really been explained in the textbooks, because under reasonable rainfall and moderate temperatures, you can get anything ranging from a very short grassland, less than your knee height, less than 50 centimeters high, through to a dense forest about 100 meters high. And in the case of Eucalyptus regnans in Tasmania, up to 110 meters high, with the occasional eucalypt that sticks out to about 120 meters high. So the tallest plant that's ever been recorded on Earth is about 120 meters. And even if that's a bit of an outlier, the forest in which it occurred, which is the Eucalyptus regnans or mountain ash forests in Tasmania and to some degree in southern Victoria on the mainland of Australia, were around about 110 meters high, under conditions not much different from several areas of short grassland around the world. Basically similar rainfall, similar to the Pampas. The mountain ash in Tasmania has a similar average annual rainfall to the Pampas. And yet one ecosystem grows a dense forest about 100 and something meters high, and the other one grows a short grassland about 50 centimeters high. Now, coming to your question of fire, none of those commonly invoked arguments apply to the Pampas. It's not a fire-prone ecosystem. And it's certainly not a dry ecosystem. As for waterlogging, well, it's chicken and egg, because certainly waterlogging does tend to militate against tree growth. On the other hand, the most parsimonious, the most simple and logical explanation for the fact that about half of the Pampas is naturally flooded during the rainy season is simply the fact that there are no trees there. So you have to distinguish cause from effect. And besides, there are many vegetation types around the world, so many that it's difficult to list them all, that are flooded and yet have trees. There are flooded forests all over the place. And in fact, one of the most one of the best known flooded forests, which is the Várzea ecosystem in Brazil, is basically underwater so deeply for much of the year that the water comes up to the crown level of the trees. And if you go canoeing there, you're basically canoeing in the canopy of a forest.
Yeah.
So, and there are mangroves, for example, which are a type of flooded forest that's not only waterlogged for all of the time. I mean, the roots of mangroves are waterlogged permanently, and they're also beset by salt. So the idea that trees cannot live with waterlogging is not true. And so that just doesn't explain anything. So drought doesn't explain it. Frost doesn't explain it, because the Pampas is not a frosty place. It's in a moderate temperate climate. It gets down, the temperature gets down to close to zero, but it's certainly not a frosty place. And so there's just no obvious explanation for the ecological strategy that we see in the Pampas, in which for some reason the biome has decided to be a natural pasture, and to make things even more remarkable, a natural pasture which, at the time that the Spanish discovered it shortly after 1500, was devoid of big game. Devoid of big game. What the heck is this all about?
Yeah, the famous ecological statements, nature abhors a vacuum, didn't seem to apply there. There was a vacuum, and the cattle and sheep seemed to rush into that vacuum. What are we missing there? What was competing with the sheep and the cattle? I assume it could be the rodents, but if the rodents kept the indigenous herbivores out, why did they not keep the cattle and other livestock out?
Yeah, just a correction. Sheep were not involved. The two species that the Spanish cut loose in the early 1500s were the domestic horse and the domestic bos taurus. Well, the question that you've asked has never been answered. That is actually a central question about the Pampas. Because it's two sides of the same question, two sides of the same coin of a question, which is, firstly, why is it that the natural herbivores of the Pampas were rodents, a variety of rodents, ranging from gopher-like through to somewhat rabbit-like, and including some semi-aquatic ones like the koipu. About 6 different categories of rodents, but all eating greens for a living, a bit like a guinea pig. In fact, relatives of the guinea pig were involved on the drier side of the Pampas. So when the Spanish encountered the Pampas shortly after 1500, they basically found a rodent paradise with a negligible incidence of hoofed game, natural indigenous hoofed game. And then, in short order, the domestic horse and the domestic bost basically took over the place, not to the exclusion of the rodents, but in addition to them. And so this seems to make no sense. It seems to defy all predictions of ecology, if ecology is indeed a science. It seems to defy principles of ecology in terms of competition, evolution, natural selection, and so forth. It's a tremendous puzzle. And so in this series, which I don't know how many episodes this series will run into, but possibly as many as 5, we're just going to try and build up the puzzle from the ground floor, and first of all introduce the Pampas, and then go on to look at what it was like when the Spaniards found it, complete with its indigenous grasses, its interesting fauna of rodents, and its enigmatic indigenous people who were purely hunter-gatherers. They kept no livestock, which is a tremendous puzzle in its own right, because it's not as if South American natives did not have livestock. They had very good livestock a little to the west in the Andes. And it's a puzzle as to why they didn't just bring down the livestock that they had and colonize the Pampas, but they didn't do so.
And any thoughts as to why goats and sheep were not used? those animals thrived in the African context, why not on the Pampas?
Well, there's an ecological reason and a historical reason. The historical reason is that the Spaniards just did not bring those animals.
Yeah.
They brought horse and bast, horse and what's commonly called cattle, which is a stupid name, because cattle just means chattels, really. It doesn't refer to a species of animal or a genus of animal even. It's just a kind of a category of goods. So we need to give this species, Bos taurus, a name, and the best name is the European bast. Now, even if the Spaniards had brought goats, they would not have taken to the Pampas, because goats tend to like environments that are both dryish and shrubby. And so there's no ecosystem in the world where natural, lush prairie, particularly prairie that's soggy underfoot for half of the year, is going to be suitable for goats. It's not their kind of thing. A goat is a semi-desert animal with a montane or, rocky bias. As for sheep, a similar argument applies, but the Pampas may have been suitable for sheep, but the Spaniards just simply didn't bring them. And by the time that the Argentinian European colonists were ready to put sheep into the Pampas, it was already the case that the ecosystem had been greatly modified. Because I'll just outline this in very brief detail before we go into it in more depth in a later episode. What happened in the Pampas was that an accidental barrier to colonization by Europeans was set up by the Europeans' own initial actions. What do I mean by that? Well, the Spanish, by accident, set off a feral phenomenon in the Pampas, which resulted in the Pampas being taken over by the horse and the bast. And then because that created new opportunities for the indigenous people, what happened was that the original modest rodent-eating Aboriginal hunter-gatherers were usurped. Their homeland was usurped by more organized, more warlike, and more enterprising groups from the west at the foothills of the Andes. And these people took over the Pampas, learned spontaneously to ride with virtually no tools, no stirrups, no saddles, no nothing. And they mastered horse riding to such a degree that they became a warlike force that could repel for literally centuries the return of Europeans who came back to the Pampas after the initial wave of Spanish colonization and eyed the Pampas as a potential farmland. So if it were not for that accidental empowerment of the indigenous people of South America in colonizing the Pampas and becoming a warlike force, the Pampas would have been converted to agriculture many years before it actually was. So it's a fact. Just the historical, anthropological, and political aspects of the Pampas are worthy of in-depth discussion.
And is there any knowledge as to whether the indigenous people took to eating the livestock and no longer relied on the rodents, or is that not documented?
Well, very little has been documented, but we can suppose that. This might be a bit bewildering, so I'll go over the chronological series again. Okay, initially at the time of Spanish arrival, about 1500, the Pampas had nothing but bands of hunter-gatherers, eating mainly rodents. Then, with the burgeoning of the feral population of ungulates, those people got usurped, driven out, or killed, and horse-riding, bast-eating American indigenous people came in. Now, they didn't civilize the place. It's not like they built cities or built corrals or did anything like that. They just lived as a bit like the so-called Plains Indians on the prairies of North America. Very, very parallel in the sense that they took over the horse. And in the case of the North Americans, they hunted the bison. In the case of the South Americans, they hunted the feral domestic bast, which is a very similar animal to the bison. And so whether they ate rodents or not, in addition to that, we can't know. But I presume that they did, because there's so many rodents in the Pampas that why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they trap dig out and eat rodents as well as domestic livestock. And so you had much more food available to this new wave of indigenous Americans on the Pampas for a century or two.
Where did those new indigenous people come from? From the Andes, or
they came from the foothills of the eastern foothills of the Andes. So west of the Pampas, between the Pampas and the Cordillera of the Andes, is an extensive foothill zone. Which was south of the Incan Empire, but like the Incan Empire, had enterprising, organized, and politically active people who were always looking for opportunity.
So they were more competitive than the hunter-gatherers on the Pampas because of the arrival of the livestock. And they were able to take advantage of that new resource, and they drove out the original hunter-gatherers. Is that right?
That's right. But what's interesting about that is that even those people who made use of livestock in feral form, they did not farm the Pampas. They just used it as a kind of a newly formed ungulate paradise. And they remained essentially hunters.
Do you think there's any possibility that there was a symbiosis of sorts between the hunter-gatherers and the rodents, and that when the hunter-gatherers are chased out, the rodents do less well?
Well, that's a fascinating possibility. Maybe we can explore that in a subsequent episode. But at first thought, it's difficult to imagine a mechanism, because the rodents, we can assume that the rodents were doing just fine with or without human effects. I mean, basically what the rodents were doing in the Pampas was they were eating grass. I mean, there were some, of course, seed-eating or partly insectivorous rodents as well. But the main biomass of rodents in the Pampas, consisting of species like the viscacha and the coipu and tuco-tucos, basically just grass eaters. Not eating bulbs, not eating seeds, not eating insects, basically just chowing grass as would a horse or a cow. They were the natural herbivores of that ecosystem. And many of them burrowing. In the case of the coipu, not burrowing, but using waterways. In the case of viscacha, tuco-tuco, and several other species burrowing. And it's hard for me to imagine that whatever those original indigenous people were doing as they harvested those rodents, whatever it was, it would benefit the rodents very much.
Possibly lighting fires, have fresh growth.
Well, the question of the original natural incidence of fires in the Pampas is impossible to know, because that ecosystem has been converted to agriculture long ago. As for the remaining, mainly eastern part of the Pampas that gets seasonally inundated, I don't think there is a fire regime at all there. And I suspect that, coming from South Africa, you and I are sort of used to the idea that where you have a grassland, you have fire. But I don't think that applies to the Pampas. Partly because the Pampas climate is so moderate that there's no real severe dry season. And partly because even where there's a dry season in grasslands, fire in grassland tends to be associated with infertility. Fire in grassland tends to be a consequence of uneaten fibrous matter that gets left by the herbivores and then constitutes fuel for fire. And because the Pampas is so fertile, basically all of the grass is edible. It's like I wouldn't call it a lawn because it was taller than a lawn, but it's similar to a lawn in the sense that basically you've just got grass growing, all of which can be eaten. And so, and considering also the fact that there's not really a fire season, there's no real opportunity for fire. That doesn't mean that fire didn't exist. It just means that it's not an important part of the Pampas ecosystem in all likelihood, the original Pampas ecosystem, and that none of the plants in the Pampas were adapted to fire in any sense, or dependent on fire in any sense for their regeneration or their fertilization or anything else. So I'm basically saying that approaching the Pampas from the point of view of fire ecology is barking up the wrong tree, if you forgive the metaphor.
No, I enjoy it. So we're coming to the end of our part one on the Pampas. Could you perhaps frame the questions that we're going to be tackling in future episodes in relation to not only the vegetation height, which we haven't posited any major reasons as to why we think it could be devoid of trees, and we'll get to that in future episodes, but also we'll be discussing how the size of mammals has changed through time. And do you perhaps want to highlight those particular questions that we'll tackle in due course?
Well, I'll highlight what I think should be the main topic of episode 2 in this series, which is the remarkable extinction of a megafauna, a megafaunal phenomenon that boggles the mind, that persisted until the hunter-gatherers arrived. So we think at the moment this is still somewhat contested, but we think at the moment that the human species arrived on the Pampas about 18,000 years ago, and possibly as recently as about 13,000 years ago. That's the kind of range of variation in the estimates. And at that time, when they arrived, more or less when they arrived, to the nearest century or so, there was a megafauna on the Pampas at the time when the Pampas extended far out to sea beyond what it does today, because you have an extensive coastal shelf east of the Pampas that was widely exposed in the late Pleistocene. And so it's a geographically different Pampas, but the same region in the sense that it was what is now Buenos Aires province, plus the what is now inundated by the sea east of that. Now, when humans arrived on this scene at the end of the Pleistocene, about, say, maybe 15 to 10,000 years ago, they encountered a big game paradise that we can describe in the next episode, which is so remarkable, so stupendous, so mind-boggling that it's actually difficult to describe, even with reference to our current big game paradises like the Serengeti. Because not only did it have zebras, lions, and elephants, but it had hypercarnivores, like the largest saber-toothed cat that's ever been recorded on Earth, plus a variety of autochthonous or originally indigenous ungulate-like mammals that we are so obscure relative to the modern fauna that it's difficult even to reconstruct them in artwork. Camel-like creatures, kind of para-ungulates or pseudo-ungulates, as well as armadillo-like glyptodons, and not to mention a whole fauna of giant sloths, which bear so little resemblance to surviving sloths that, again, it's difficult to imagine what they would have been like. So a truly amazing megafauna, nothing like a rhino, admittedly, and possibly nothing like a hippo, or there was a thing called a toxodon, which is sometimes compared to hippos. But even just envisaging the megafauna that we have in the world today, such as elephant, mainly the elephant, and the largest ungulates, like the largest bovines, like the Asian water buffalo, even using those as a kind of a template, what you had on the Pampas at the time of human arrival, towards the end of the Pleistocene and going into the beginning of the Holocene, was a megafauna that compounds the puzzle of the Pampas enormously, because it creates this historical or chronological contrast between the biggest big game ecosystem on Earth, basically, and the reduction of that to a rodent dominated ecosystem. So you went from a land of elephants toxodons, zebras, lions, and other crazy looking large ungulate-like animals, through to and their predators, through to a grassland on which the largest indigenous animal was a modest-sized deer in small numbers, about 30 kilos, about the weight of a South African springbok, which is not a large animal in the scheme of things. And then most of the herbivory going on by a slew of rodents ranging from mouse size and semi-subterranean or fossorial through to about big rabbit size. And in the case of the capybara, up to about 50 kilograms. So that transition from the Pleistocene megafauna that humans encountered when they first arrived on the Pampas about 10,000 years ago, and what the Spaniards encountered when they came in 1500-ish, that contrast is so mind-boggling and so unexplained that it constitutes possibly the biggest ecological puzzle that has ever been discovered in science.
Mm.
And part of our motivation in this several-part series here on exploring the bioage is, even if we can't answer the puzzle, at least to lay it out and bring it to light for the full puzzle that it is. Because until we understand how the Pampas was transformed from a big game paradise to something equally remarkable in the opposite direction, which is the least big game ecosystem on Earth, considering how fertile and well watered it is, I don't think we can really claim to have much knowledge of the basic principles of ecology and evolution.
And I'm assuming you don't accept the argument that the hunter-gatherers just century by century knocked off all these mega herbivores. That's not a solid argument for you.
Well, we can go into that in considerable detail. The basic reason why it does not persuade me is that, as you said, nature is supposed to abhor a vacuum. And it's not as if all of the big animals in South America were killed off. There were still there's still tapirs, there's still the huanaco and camelids, and there's still a considerable fauna of deer. For example, if you go up to northernmost Argentina into the Pantanal, there's a reasonably sized species of deer. The males can get up to about 100 kilograms. And so there's a variety of remaining, I wouldn't call them megafauna, but remaining considerably large ungulate-like animals scattered around South America, which could easily have adapted enough to invade the Pampas in modified form. But that didn't happen. Nothing like, even the huanaco, which is about 100 kilogram sized camelid that is widespread in southern and southwestern South America, did not occur on the Pampas. So the historical accidents involved just simply don't explain why the vacuum persisted despite the supposed abhorrence of a vacuum by nature.
And particularly because it's a very fertile soil. You would expect wildlife to thrive and trees to thrive. And so correct. In future episodes, we'll tackle those conundrums head on.
Yes, and just to give a little bit of a spoiler to prospective listeners, we may actually suggest naughtily that it is the very fertility of the Pampas that has disbarred or excluded both trees and large herbivores. And that's where the ecological principles get really exciting, because it could be that we have to invert the textbooks in the sense that what favors trees, such as returning to our mountain ash forests of 100 meters high in Tasmania, what favors trees is a lack of fertility, a lack of balance in the nutritional environment. And what favors large mammals, such as elephants and so on, is actually, in some sense, an adverse environment in which large size has an advantage in mobility over small size. And that introduces the strange idea that where you have an ultimate paradise of productivity, deep fertile soils, reasonable rainfall with a fair distribution through the year, a lack of frost, a lack of drought, a lack of fire, a perfect kind of natural farm, what actually arises in that ecosystem is rodents, because they can consume vegetation as rapidly as big animals. They They don't need to move. And so they perform the function of herbivores through their rapid growth and reproduction in a way that leaves no niche open for anything bigger. And that's a truly interesting thought, because the human mind tends to assume that where there's a big opportunity, there'll be a big animal. And that's not necessarily the case.
Or a big tree.
Or a big tree, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. Look forward to exploring that further with you in the episodes to come.
Well, okay, listeners, thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And we'll continue the series with the Pampas in our next episode, and looking forward to seeing you all then.
Great. Cheerio.
Okay, over.